The psychoanalyst Carl Jung writes, "Everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. If an inferiority is conscious, one always has a chance to correct it. But if it is repressed and isolated from consciousness, it never gets corrected and is liable to burst forth suddenly in a moment of unawareness." Jung spoke of two types of shadows. There is the personal shadow, the unknown and often unwelcome dark side of our own personality. And then there is what has come to be known as the collective shadow, the unknown dark side of an entire society. The sudden eruption of evil on a national scale, as seen in the Rwandan genocide or Nazi Germany, can be understood not as a random historical anomaly, but as a catastrophic manifestation of this collective shadow. To comprehend how seemingly civilized nations descend into such atrocities, we must first explore the darkness that lies dormant within the individual psyche. The problem, the personal shadow and projection. To begin, we must understand the concept Jung powerfully termed the personal shadow, the thing a person has no wish to be. It is the sum of all those unpleasant qualities we like to hide, even from ourselves. The shadow contains inferiorities, repressed instincts, and perceived weaknesses which everyone possesses, but prefers not to acknowledge, traits that may seem socially unacceptable or even evil. The problem is that these repressed parts of ourselves do not simply disappear. Instead, they operate autonomously in the unconscious, influencing our behavior in ways we may not recognize. One may suddenly express a hostile remark completely out of character, or find oneself acting in a manner contrary to one's conscious values. When these shadow aspects are not confronted and integrated, we tend to project them onto others. This psychological maneuver is a powerful defense mechanism. It protects our fragile ego from the painful truth of our own flaws. The ego, in its desperate bid for self-preservation, cannot bear the weight of its own perceived ugliness. Therefore, it casts that ugliness outward, finding a home for it in another. Think of the politician you despise for their perceived dishonesty, or the celebrity you judge for their vanity. Jung would suggest that the intensity of our emotional reaction is a clue. Often, the very traits that trigger our outrage in others are the ones we have most forcefully disowned in ourselves. That individual one cannot tolerate for their perceived arrogance may in fact be a mirror reflecting a repressed arrogance in oneself. Projection is a cognitive blind spot that convinces us the problem is always out there, never in here. This individual mechanism is the foundation for a far larger societal dysfunction. The darkness spreads, the collective shadow. A personal problem becomes a national catastrophe when individual shadows are magnified and merged at the level of an entire society. This creates the collective shadow, the shared, unacknowledged dark side of a nation's culture and history. It consists of all that which opposes our shared and professed collective values, historical injustices, systemic inequalities, national shames, and a latent capacity for violence that a society refuses to confront within itself. When a society is under significant stress from economic depression, political instability, or social upheaval, it becomes desperate for a simplistic explanation or a target for its suffering. This fertile ground of collective anxiety is where the seeds of mass projection take root. A charismatic leader or ruling party can then channel this free-floating fear and anger, directing it with laser-like focus onto a vulnerable minority. It is at this moment that the devastating power of mass projection is unleashed. This scapegoat is never chosen at random. It is often a group that is already marginalized, visibly different, or has a history of being othered, making them an easy and plausible target for the nation's projected self-hatred. The nation begins to project its own unacknowledged darkness, its fears, its failures, its rage, onto this designated group. Jung, witnessing the mass movements of his time, identified this as a form of mass psychosis. In Nazi Germany, the German people, reeling from national humiliation and economic collapse, projected their deep-seated feelings of inferiority and weakness onto the Jewish population. Nazi propaganda was the engine for this process, methodically dehumanizing an entire group to make them the symbolic container for all of the nation's ills. A similar dynamic ignited the Rwandan genocide, where Hutu extremists used radio broadcasts to relentlessly portray the Tutsi population as inhuman cockroaches, thereby activating a collective shadow that turned neighbors into murderers. In both instances, the eruption was the violent culmination of a long period of denial and mass projection. The mechanics of mass psychosis, this terrible descent into collective madness, follows a discernible and terrifying pattern. Stage 1. Collective denial. It begins when a society systematically ignores its most pressing issues. Whether it be deep-seated racial tensions or a legacy of historical injustice, the nation chooses to put the past behind us without genuine reconciliation. This denial creates a powerful, unspoken tension that festers beneath the surface of society, seeking an outlet. Stage 2. The identification of a scapegoat. As internal pressure builds, influential figures may emerge who offer a seductive and dangerously simple explanation. The nation's suffering is the fault of a specific group. This group, an ethnic minority, immigrants, or a political faction, becomes the screen onto which the nation projects its collective shadow, its fears, its failures, and its own dark impulses. Stage 3. The echo chamber and mass psychosis. Once the scapegoat is identified, the narrative is rigidly and aggressively controlled. Dissent is portrayed as disloyalty, and critical thought is replaced by raw appeals to emotion and group identity. Media and propaganda channels create a relentless echo chamber where the official narrative is repeated until it is perceived as objective truth, drowning out any dissenting voices. The individual is faced with a terrible choice: conform or be cast out. To remain connected to the group, which feels like survival itself, one must adopt its delusions. The mind's natural capacity for critical thought is surrendered in exchange for a feeling of belonging and righteous purpose. The individual's internal moral compass is shattered and replaced by the single overriding directive of the group. This fosters a mass psychosis, a societal delusion where a large portion of the population loses its connection to reality, moving as a single entity without individual conscious thought. Stage 4. The eruption. With the shadow fully projected and the population in a state of psychosis, the final stage becomes almost inevitable. The repressed darkness, now legitimized and aimed at a dehumanized target, erupts with horrifying force. Atrocities that would be unthinkable for a conscious individual become permissible, even righteous, for the group. Participants often describe a chilling feeling of being swept away by a force larger than themselves, their individual humanity replaced by an automated and ruthless function of the mob. The solution: confronting the shadow. Jung's work, however, does not leave us in despair, but points toward a solution. The path out of this destructive cycle is what he called shadow work. He famously stated, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." Confronting the shadow is the courageous act of acknowledging one's own capacity for evil. On an individual level, this is a process of radical self-honesty, of asking difficult questions about one's own biases, prejudices, and emotional triggers. It means withdrawing our projections and taking responsibility for our own inner world. This is not a simple process. As one of Jung's closest collaborators, Marie-Louise von France, writes, "One must learn to get along with the shadow, sometimes by giving in, sometimes by resisting, sometimes by giving love, whatever the situation requires." This implies a dynamic relationship, not a battle to the death. Integration isn't about destroying the shadow, which is impossible, but about understanding its needs, its origins, and its language, thereby bringing it into a conscious and manageable relationship with the whole personality. This is the process of the realization of the shadow. It is the beginning of a long and difficult work of self-education. Through it, we can observe our shadow outwardly by watching our emotional reactions with honesty, and inwardly by exploring our dreams. By consciously integrating our darkness, we take away its autonomous power. Jung warned that an unacknowledged shadow is liable to burst forth suddenly in a moment of unawareness. Consciousness is the antidote, the conscious individual as the solution. The prevention of such collective evil begins not in governments or on battlefields, but within the psyche of the individual. A society is merely a collection of individuals, and its collective shadow is the sum of its unexamined personal shadows. Therefore, the health and consciousness of a nation can never exceed the health and consciousness of its people. A person who has done the difficult work of integrating their own shadow becomes more resilient to the pull of mass psychosis. They develop the psychological immunity to recognize scapegoating and projection for what they are and refuse to participate. They become the crucial circuit breakers in the machinery of collective madness. The goal is not perfection, but what Jung termed the wholeness of personality, which arises from a balance between our conscious and unconscious realms. The Russian writer and Gulag survivor Alexander Solzhenitsyn came to a similar conclusion, writing, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through the middle of every human heart. Jung's ultimate warning was that the greatest danger to civilization is not an external enemy, but our own unacknowledged psyche. For Jung, our primary and most potent response to evil must be the relentless quest for self-knowledge. The individual must come to know, without flinching, how much good they can do and what crimes they are capable of. Confronting this truth is our greatest and most essential power.